of Art Japan 1921, which is the exhibition I hope you all have had a chance to visit this afternoon. The exhibition was curated by Anna Marie Sawkins, who you may recall curated our Nature of Wisconsin show a few years ago. This show, Jan, Sarah, and I conceived as part of a trilogy of shows having to do with the major Asian cultures. The trilogy beginning in 2019 with India. Some of you may have seen that exhibition. And then today's, the current show, Japan, which leads us to the Anderson Japanese Gardens and speaker today. And the third exhibition will be China in the fall of this year. Jan and I have been thinking a lot about the China show, which she is organizing with Kate Hawley. And we've been doing a lot of reading. And I saw a passage only this morning after last night's storms. And it's Adrienne Wang has written a semi-autobiographical story of her life growing up Chinese in America. And her grandmother said to her, "Trees desire peace, but the wind never stops." I would like to thank Christine Anderson and Danielle Passwaters for organizing this event this afternoon. John Boyd helped with the technical services. Shireen Tomaszewski wiped out here, custodial staff cleaned every touch point in the warehouse on the first floor, including chair arms and back seats in preparation for this event. We first learned about the Anderson Japanese Gardens from Carrie Johnson, who's the executive director of the Rockford Art Museum. She is our connection to Tim Gruner, who's the garden curator and head of horticulture at the Anderson Japanese Gardens, Rockford, Illinois. We welcome Tim and his wife, Shelley, here to the warehouse. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for being here. First of all, I'm fully vaccinated, and would anyone mind if I took my mask off while I talk? I think it might help me be a better communicator. Thank you. So, I have been at Anderson Gardens in various roles leading up to this curator role since 1989. And what brought me to the garden was my lifelong love of nature. I had been on a number of backpacking trips, and it was on a backpacking trip that I really felt like I had to work with plants somehow in my life. And so nature informed that. I came back, I talked to the counselor, he said, "Have you ever thought of horticulture?" And I had. And I said, so I went down and looked at a program, I thought, yeah, I can do this. And on a class trip, I went to Anderson Japanese Gardens. I didn't even know Anderson Japanese Gardens existed. that same kind of feeling that I felt in the mountains, clarity. Really, in the mountains was the first time I'd ever felt clarity in my life. At 22 years old, pretty confused, wayward, no particular direction, and but I felt clear-minded. And when I went to the garden for the first time on that first tour, that kind of feeling came back to me, and I was astounded by that and wondered how could this landscape that was put together by people create that impact on me. And so I became fascinated. After graduation from horticulture school, I went to the Chicago Botanic Garden and spent a year there as an intern. Did a few other things, ended up working at a garden in Costa Rica for a few months, came back, started working at Anderson Gardens. My networking paid off. I kind of bugged them long enough until they finally gave me a job. And it's been an amazing thing, working with Hoichi Kurisu, I'll talk a little bit more later, just the array of craftsmen and artists, and it's been an amazing experience in so many ways. So what I'd like to do here this afternoon is share with you a pretty brief history of the garden's construction, and then look at, because this is an art world, and because I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the things that inform Japanese garden design. One, the original connection between human beings and nature, and then second, the patterns in nature that are utilized by garden designers to illustrate that intimate connection that we really have with nature, and if we don't have it, we need to find it again. So this will be a little bit of a quick history of the garden, and then if we have time for some questions afterward, I'm happy to ask. I'm hoping this is about 1 hour. If you need to leave, you won't feel bad. So just if you have to leave with no ill feelings. Here we go. If at any point, so my tendency is to look while I'm talking, and if the mic gets kind of out of the line and you can't hear me, just give me a signal. Let me know. So the garden's origin stems back to the gentleman on the left, John Anderson, who was challenged by his parents that if he graduated, and there was some question about that, from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, he was working on a business degree. If he graduated, they would send him anywhere he wanted in the world for 6 weeks. He had already been to Europe, and he did graduate. The family had done a lot of business with the Japanese, particularly in the milk packaging business. The Anderson family made machines that packaged milk products. They ended up touring the garden with a gentleman on the right, Mr. Akira Ono, whose family owned one of the largest dairy companies in Japan, the Morinaga Milk Company. And so on that 6 weeks journey, they saw all kinds of things in Japan, the Golden Pavilion, intimate rustic spaces, and it was on this trip that John fell in love with the people, the culture, and in particular the way the gardens made him feel. And so the seed was planted in 1966 that someday he thought he would like to have a Japanese garden. And then the emergence of another person in John's life, Mr. Hoichi Kurisu here on the left. Hoichi was trained in Japan in the mid-60s by one of Japan's great 20th century garden builder, designer, and teachers, Mr. Kenzo Ogata. So Hoichi was an apprentice of Ogata for 5 years, did the tough stuff, and learned how to build Japanese gardens. He had gone on to be the second director of the Portland Japanese Garden. Anybody in here seen the Portland Japanese Garden? So if you have, it's a wonderful garden. It was actually on a trip to Portland in 1978 that John saw the Portland Garden for the first time and was blown away by it. That feeling that he had felt in Japan came back, similar to my experience in the mountains when I saw Anderson Gardens for the first time. So he did some investigation, found Hoichi's name, contacted him, and in 1978, Hoichi came to the garden for the first time. The site looked pretty much like this. It was a second growth swampy area right near a perennial stream called Spring Creek, which is just a quarter or a half mile away from emptying into the Rock River. So we are a water-rich garden. There's lots of water. The site looked like that. This is an early image of excavation for an area near what we call the beach. And then some years later, that space looked like this. So this is the first area that was worked on. So from 1978 through about 1982, the East Waterfall construction looks pretty bare bones. A nice filtered view of the falls some 35 years later, 35 to 40 years later. This is the space, this little stone pagoda. This is the stream that flows from the East Waterfall down to the pond. It was this spot where I stood as a student, and that feeling came over me that, like, wow, how can this space have this kind of impact on me? But it was right here in near this stone pagoda that happened. That'll always be a very special place for me. There are viewing houses, the zigzag bridge, the 8-section bridge, the Yatsuhashi, lots of koi. So this is all the pond strolling garden. Another view of the zigzag bridge. This building that looks like a Japanese structure is actually a pump house. So we have great Japanese architecture. This is a look-alike. Then the next big project was 1984, and that would be construction of the guest house, which was done in Skia style, which is a classic architectural style of Japan. Very influenced by tea. Loosely, Skia is the style of tea. And so here are the woodworkers, two woodworkers from Japan, Masahiro Hamada and, okay, I'm drawing a blank on the other guy. Okay, well, Hamada was the top guy. He was the front man. He was the head guy. They were here for 6 months working on construction of the guest house. Here they are cutting the posts and beams at the maintenance shop. The posts and beams, it's classic post and beam construction. They spent 6 weeks working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, cutting all the posts and beams, all the joinery. It's all held together with joints. Wedges, tenons, mortises, all kinds of interesting slots, and it's a pretty remarkable style, much in the way that old barns were built here in the Midwest, but just maybe a little more finicky and refined. The load-bearing structure, after 6 weeks of carving, went up in 3 days. And here is the Mr. Anderson and his father and Hamada, and I can't remember the guy's name, and the other guy. But this is during when the ridge beam was set, and this is a ceremony to dedicate that moment. This still resides up in the attic, strapped to the main beam. And then by the end of 1985, the building was primarily complete with most of the landscape installed around it. This is the main entrance, the Ingawa. Not the Ingawa, never mind, it doesn't matter. My Japanese words sometimes get away from me. But from inside the building looking out, the main walk up to the building, standing on the near end, the elevated deck, and the upper level, it's a 2-level building, looking out at the Karisansui, the raked gravel. And then another view of that dry garden, a little atypical of the dry garden. Often they're in a walled space. This one, Hoichi, he's a rule bender, and he likes to elbow out away from conformity. This dry garden actually has a stream that runs along the back side of it. And all through this time, with the support of Mr. Anderson and his wife Linda, who basically, when Hoichi and his crew would come, when the woodworkers would come, they all lived at the Anderson house, which was a beautiful thing. They got to know these people very well. And so Linda was actually the first tour guide that Anderson Gardens had. This was a backyard project. It was just their backyard. But as time went on, it became more noted, and local people wanted to come and see it, and then garden groups from the region wanted to see it. So she ran the Hotel Anderson, as it was called, and also was the first tour guide. This is, for all practical purposes, the plan for another big garden space, which was the West Waterfall, which construction started on the West Waterfall in 1988 with the driving of the steel pilings. And then I started in 1989, so this was the project that I sort of cut my teeth on there and learned about process and problem solving and structural things and horticultural things all wrapped into one. So this conceptual drawing is really it. There are no blueprints for this garden. And from that, once John okayed the idea, then we just went out and started building. This one was a little more extreme because this is a 20-foot vertical fall. The waterfall actually will end up starting from way up here. It's about 50 vertical feet. This is a concrete wall that will hold a big boulder retention wall, and you'll see a little bit later when it's finished. So you can see the boulders being stacked up against the steel. Every one of them is drilled, and then pins are inserted and welded to the wall, and then backfilled with concrete. It was quite an epic project. That's little Timmy Gruner right there, 1989. Still had a lot of hair, and there were signs though. It wasn't good. But anyway, steel wall, there were 750 tons of boulders set on that project, 30 days of rock setting, and Huichi would come in, we'd set rocks, get them all fastened down. When he would leave, we would build the next retention wall up the hill farther, and then he'd come back and set more rocks. And then some years later, this is the effect of that area. And again, that was the only real plan right there. So it's all done, very art-oriented. It's feet on the ground, designing in place with the inspiration of the rock and how things were moving and progressing. And there's actually the drone shot that gives you a sense, sort of like the bird's eye view of the space. So this is a 1989, the gazebo was added in 1990. Fall shot of the same area. And then the next major project was the tea house of 1991. And so very close to the West Waterfall. You can see the same Hamada, the woodworker, and his son this time, his son Kenichiro. They essentially cut the posts and beams in Japan and brought them here and assembled them on the foundation that we built. First we had to build this boulder wall to hold the slope back, but it's post and beam construction. You can see the wedges being driven into the tenons that go through the mortise in the piece that the tenon projects through. The rocks the posts are scribed to fit the rocks very carefully. Things moving along, getting ready for the stucco. The tile are ready to go on the roof. And then the adjacent garden, the tea garden. This stone translates to this way the mountain path. The idea of the tea house is a remote mountain retreat, far away from the stress of the city. And the idea is to create the aura of a journey into the country. And so walking out from this path through the forest, if you will, there's a bridge, this earth-style bridge that it's not a fancy bridge. It's a bridge that you might find in an area of the country made of logs and sticks and mud, essentially. And so that's the bridge as it stands now. So you walk across, it's a rustic world. There's a little waiting area for tea called the Machiai. And the guests would assemble here before the host would come out and invite them in for tea ceremony. And then the path up to the tea house, from the Machiai through a gate that divides the outer from the inner. So you're further moving into this inner sanctum of the tea room, far away in the mountains. And then another view of the tea house. Chisokuan, the sign reads, which is loosely realization hut. So it's a place to, with a clear mind, think about whatever, whether it's philosophy or music or poetry or whatever. And then a view out of the tea room towards down the stream that flows over to that big waterfall that we built. The next major project was the Garden of Reflection. This is a pavilion, and this was built as a large event space. And so there are festivals, concerts, weddings, all sorts of things, very public engagement. And what we came to learn is that Japanese gardens weren't just places of quiet meditation. They were places for parties. There were drinking games and music and all these things happening in these tranquil gardens. These tranquil gardens were also used for entertainment. And so this garden was built more for public events, whether it's Japanese festivals. We also have wine tastings and beer tasting events. This is a concert at the garden. We have concerts every Tuesday during the summer. And a couple shots of the Garden of Reflection. This was a 2000 project. So we're looking at the work that was done up until 2000. There's the Anderson's office, which is not really a part of the garden, but it's surrounded by it. Was built in 1997. And the next major project is this, and again, this is the working drawing for this project. That's it. There were a couple other little details of some detailed drawings in a couple areas, but this is what we work with. Koichi has the idea. You can see this Boulder Wall that we had to build along. This is the creek. This is a little more formal bridge called the Giboshi Bridge, which has these bronze finials on top of the posts to protect them, called Giboshi, which literally means pasta. So there's the plan. There was a seawall that held the creek back. This creek is a raging monster. After about 2 to 3 inches of rain, it's extraordinary how fast it flashes up. It's always had water in it. No one's ever known it to be dry. But when it rains, it turns into a savage creature. And so we had to build this boulder wall before we put the gate in, because once the gate was in, we'd never get back in here. So that was a major project. Here's Hoichi down in there. You can see the size of these boulders. There's some of these boulders are in the 4 to 8 ton range. They're all propped up, and we'll go back in and drill holes in these, insert pins, and then backfill with concrete. So it ends up being all one big unified glob of rock, concrete, and steel. And then the gate construction begins. And this is the same Hamada and his crew of 3 from Japan, and one of them was a coppersmith that did the copper shingled roof. And most of the big boulders that sit between the creek and the gate were lifted over the gate, which is a little bit nerve-wracking, but you have to trust the cabling, and we never had any incident. This is a small, kind of a serendipitous garden. We needed to have a certain amount of space between the bottom of the sill and the ground so that water splashing off the roof wouldn't splash up onto the wood. And so this is in effect, these sunken gardens were created to create that space. And so it wasn't part of any original plan. It was just like, oh, the elevation's higher over here, we need to do something about this. And in the field, this design was made. Koichi did a little bit of a sketch. And then this is just a few years ago. This image was taken in the spring, and then the same space in the fall, and in the winter. So that's 2005, and through all of it, Mr. Anderson is planting Packy, whether just out of the mod 70s, this is probably the very early 80s, up until nearly present. This is a few years ago, but he's super engaged with Hoichi, and when Hoichi's out there, he's a part of it. He's out there wanting to know what's happening and how things are going and what's next. The visitor center was built in 2006, and so it's an 8,000 square foot floor plan with an upper and lower level. There's a gallery, there's a restaurant. This is looking off one of the decks that supports the restaurant. You can see the dining room chairs in there. I think it seats about 150. This sunken garden with this kaisansui, the raked gravel, actually functions as a light well for the people in the lower level offices. But it actually takes all the water, and this is actually an engineered flood wall. The 100-year flood line is right here, 1 foot below the top of the glass, but it's an engineered glass wall. That they say will hold back that much flood water. You can see inside the building, it is also a post-and-beam construction, but not mortise and tenons with joinery. It's all big brackets and so forth. But still, it's a pretty impressive structure. So the Anderson's house used to be up here. Here's the original garden, guest house, the big waterfall, the West Waterfall, round gazebo, machiai, tea house, main gate. Here's the pavilion that I showed you with the events, the garden of reflection, and the visitor center. So what started out as a backyard garden has now sprawls out over 12 acres. And it's amazing, in the time of COVID, our numbers of people coming to the garden keep increasing. So this year we're probably going to have right around 70 to 80,000 people visit the garden. When I started, there were 2,000 people a year coming to the garden. So it's amazing how much things have changed. So we looked at a little bit about the construction history of the garden, and I just wanted to give you a quick sense. There's way more to this than I can talk about in an hour or even several hours to all the things that inform Japanese garden design. But it really fundamentally is the human nature connection, and then the patterns in nature that can be expressed in ways that mean something. And again, I think it was the expression of those patterns by Hoichi and then the gardeners that trained the trees for years afterward that impacted me. It was a believable space. So there's an intimate connection between garden and architecture. This is the guest house with the copper and tile roof, the raked gravel garden, the main entrance over here, and the integration is pretty wonderful. So we know why. What's so important about gardens, or gardens period? I mean, but in particular now, Japanese gardens. We know that time spent in nature can have benefits: calming, peaceful, tranquil. Gardens can create a sense of mystery and wonder. And then the metaphor in gardens. The Andersons also built a garden at a youth alcohol and substance abuse treatment center in Rockford called Rosecrans. And they use garden metaphor and nature metaphor as, giving kids a model to visualize what success could be. And some of these kids have lived really difficult lives with abuse that is almost unimaginable. And yet you look at a tree like this is in Zion National Park, you look at those trees and with the meagerest of resources, you know, punished by the elements, the heat, wind, and almost no water, and yet out of that something beautiful can grow. So I think that metaphor itself, you know, every kid should know that. Everyone that has trouble should know that healing can occur, and from great trouble can grow, you know, really a strong individual. So a quality Japanese garden can evoke these timeless reactions to ancient and mysterious nature and human connections. I firmly believe that. Historical Japanese culture. It wasn't us and nature. It was nature and humanity were the same thing. And I think that it's pretty clearly illustrated in the integration of nature and architecture. That's a view of the tea house. So if you will, the human component, geometric shape and line, symmetry, nature with organic shape and line, generally asymmetrical. And then the Japanese garden brings those things together. This again is the West Waterfall with these two slabs of stone, rectangular, but not crisp and clean. They're a bit irregular, a little bit distressed. They have great patina, so they fit in a natural space. If those were polished granite, probably not. So nature and humanity part of the same thing, and there's this kind of organic and geometric fusion. Look at the undulating lines of these beds, the geometric grid that's been raked in here, which can change every day, and sometimes it's big circles. It's not always like this. But look at these big rectangular planes that radiate away from the building. It's that juxtaposition of geometric and organic line that I find just really invigorating. Looking from inside the guest house out, in effect, the garden and the architecture become one space. And in Japan, there's a term, and I don't remember it, but it's the space we live in. It's all the space. It's not just the house. It's not the house and the garden. The whole thing is the space that we live in. And this space is like the interface between nature and, you know, humanity's architecture. The line of the E, the squareness of all this architecture. Look at how it radiates out into the space around it, with these long rectangular planes that are parallel with it. Even there's a couple little slabs of stone over here that are parallel with the E. And so that in effect, kind of like the gravitational effect of the architecture is seen. When we get out away from that, some of the stones start to turn a little bit, even if they're rectangularly cut, because they're outside of the influence and they can start to act on their own. But things close to the building are very much related to the building. This is the tea house, and so the guest house in its Sakiya style. Look at the material in this building, and this is classic Japanese architecture. This is a traditional 4.5 mat, 4.5 tatami mat tea room. You won't live in a house like this. It is just for tea ceremony. And yet this is where the architectural style of Japan came out of the tea ceremony in this case. So you have this main post that holds up, you know, that is an important player in the structure. This little elevated space. This post still has its bark on it. And you can look at, you know, the flooring. The tatami is a rush called igusa that's grown especially for this. The mats are made of compressed rice straw covered by this woven igusa. And then, you know, the stucco is of a color of earth, clay used in Japan to make clay plaster walls. You've got sooty bamboo from like an old kitchen. The patina of that is relish. You've got round poles. These poles are grown special for this. They're round poles that have the bark peeled off, revealing the living edge of the wood. But they're round. They're like sticks. And then hoggy, it's a bush clover, is the ceiling material. Little stems of hoggy lined up right next to each other. This is not bamboo here. This is actually red pine with the bark still on it. So you can see the use of natural material throughout the structures. In effect, inviting nature in. The levels of formality, the tea house would be probably the least formal area because it is a rustic retreat after all, far away in the mountains. But you know, this stone, yes, it's cut stone, but it's either hand hammered or flame finished to have this rough appearance. And so the formality level is important when choosing all the elements in a garden, whether it's a lantern or some sort of statuary, stone. And again, I've been sort of suggesting that lines of architecture radiate into the landscape. So here the strong geometric shape of this gate echoed by the shape of the lantern. And then you can see these rectangular planes in the stone. They don't need to be there, but they do aesthetically because it helps to integrate. It helps with the architecture that kind of stretches out into the space around it. From underneath the gate, you look out and you can see here's these big rectangular planes that kind of drift. They kind of wind away. Within those planes, there are squares, there are rectangles of stone here, 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 and here. So you can see the influence of architecture beyond the architecture. And then also on the other side of the gate, here's another lantern that is square. In the guest house, there is a round window that looks out the west side, and the lantern is round. The way streams flow in nature guide stream construction. So all the streams, with the exception of the main creek that runs through the garden, are man-made. But basic principles, you know, streams turn for a reason, whether it's a landform or an outcrop. They tend to be wider in the turns. Gravel bars form on the inside. There's also another gravel bar that can form towards the outside of the curve. Islands with downstream accumulations of soil where plants can take root. All those kind of things are figured in when building a stream. And you can see that when you walk through the garden, what we call turning stones. The water is moved by a stone and it's kicked out around it. There's more width here than there is down here in the straightaway. And paths also mimic the way streams flow, wider in the turns, and in effect emptying out into the water in this case. Notice how the tree leans? The tree is leaning just a little bit in the same direction. So in effect the stream moves towards, the path moves towards the water, the tree is leaning towards the water a little bit too. Here's another, this is a flowing water style, and it's the boulders with the water trickling between them is the idea. Another very kind of riverine sort of feeling of these tobeishi, these stepping stones. And then you've got spaces as you approach the guest house with long, straight runs of, you know, cut or chipped stone. The guys used to actually break all this stone with an iron edge and a hammer to get the shapes they want. Now with the advent of diamond side grinder bits, that makes that a lot quicker and a lot easier. But sort of in a way the skill was lost, that incredible craftsmanship that it took to break a stone on the line where you wanted it. Oops, sorry about that. I went backwards. But look at how, here's a transitional device that takes you away from the rectangular nature of this path, the long straight line, dissipates out into the space, and now another wave takes over. And it's a little more regular. It becomes a little more angular up in this space because this actually feeds into a space that's more angular. It's a large angular space. So I think Hoichi is brilliant at doing transitional spaces. The way forests behave on steep slopes, in this case being undercut and probably falling over, this is Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But look at how, oops, sorry, wrong button. Look at how the trunk curves like this. And these are leaning. These are leaning in response to this guy, who is leaning back a little bit in response to them. But in general, on slopes, this is the pattern that we use right here. And then the way you can see, they're not all the same angle. There's little bits of differences. And when people ask me, how do you know how to prune? How do you know what to do? Well, really, in a quality pruning job, the plant needs to be planted in the right way first, with maybe leaning in the right direction, with a nice branch that's got a curve that enunciates that line in the direction of whatever flow you want, whether it's along a sidewalk or along a stream. This is that principle. You see how this actually, it's not only towards the water, but it's downstream of the flow. So then when we line up plants, when we plant them crooked and then downstream of the flow, in towards the water and downstream. So when you walk through the garden, you can see that along streams and along paths, because we treat the paths like a stream in terms of how the plants would grow, near them and around them. This is this is a steep slope. Look at how all these plants have this trend, all the way down the stream. And this is looking out of the guest house at the garden. It's the same principle. This relationship right here, this tree and this tree they are working together. This is certainly the dominant one, but as the subordinate, this one has an important role to play. And then if you're actually standing in this space, you can see that up here, way up here on the hill, the big hill that follows the east-west line of the garden, those trees are all growing on an angle like that on the slope. And so that by connecting these lines with those lines, it makes the space unified, harmonious, if you will. This is a drawing of Luigi that illustrates the principle of Kisei, or the flow of an object's energy. And you can see how when he sets, this is a drawing, and so it's easier to get away with it, but in real life, the rocks also have directional energy, and you arrange them so that they are projecting in the direction of flow. Very much like this picture. And I'm trying to go back. There we go. You can see how these trees all lean. There's prominent branches in the direction of the lean. The lobes of these peninsulas, the flow of the water back behind them. Look at the line. Look at that line right there. Even the trees that are more upright, they were planted crooked so that they have a curve in the bottom that is pulling in the same direction. And so here's Koichi's illustration of Kisei. So when we prune, if we replace plants, when we prune, we have to keep these principles in mind, keep the space unified. Pruning and planting, whether it's one trunk or multiple trunks, the canopy ends up being like one canopy. Whether it's, if you're driving through the country around here, you can see oak trees out in the fields and whatnot. The ones that have been limbed up, if there's one or if there's 10, it doesn't matter. They'll have the canopy of one tree if they're growing close enough together. And so that basically illustrates how to prune. This is a wetland near our house, and you can see the same principle. Here's the trees, the branches growing over the light's up here, right? And so these go straight up to the light, but these are challenged because these guys are pressuring them for light, and so they have to grow away. They grow to where the light is, and then even like in some cases, they'll grow all the way down. They'll recurve all the way down to the ground. But you can see this is the whole pattern of a forest, whether it's
100 miles wide or 100 feet wide. You know, this movement on the edges and straight up and down, more or less in the middle. Another tree, this is a great pattern. This is a little more complex, but you can see the general arrangement. Look at these branches reverting towards the ground. Upright in the top. So those are great patterns for pruning. Here's a maple tree in the garden, pruned in the same way. It's been there for over 40 years. It should be 40 feet tall, but it's a little over 20, and it has the impact of a tree that's, maybe a century or more old. Leaning plants imply motion, express that kise, and can create harmony when everything works together. The same way, these trees, this is a forest in the garden of reflection. The creek is down here, but Hoichi wants to focus the visual energy towards the pond. The other side of the creek has the same thing. The trees are growing at an angle because they're on a steep slope. That is transferred to these trees. Look at they're not all exactly the same because it has to feel not contrived. It has to look natural. Prominent branches. See here, 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 gesturing in the direction of visual flow. And I mentioned this tree earlier. It wasn't accidental that it's crooked. It was planted that way. The flow of the path into this wetland area, that tree projects out towards this peninsula. So when everything works together, you might not know that, I don't know why I like this, but I like it. There's a lot of visual cluing at play. I have to mention tea ceremony because it's such an important part of what this architecture and garden is. A lot of things evolve out of tea. This is the guest house with Professor Kimiko Gunji from the University of Illinois. And does anyone know David Munganast in this room? He's a Milwaukee guy. All right, we got a David Munganast. All right, beautiful. Yeah, so David was Professor Gunji's first teaching assistant. David's actually in Japan right now with his husband Michael. They've been there for a year and a half.